Yeah. Thank you very much, everyone. Good morning, good morning, good morning. So, first of all, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the lands and waterways on which we gather. Today, we pass through the lands of the Camaragal peoples who have cared for this country for countless generations. We pay our respect to elders past and present and recognise their enduring connection to land, sea and sky and community. We honour their wisdom, culture and resilience as they pass it on to future generations. So welcome everybody to today's mid-candidature review. Before I hand it over to Holly, I'd just like to introduce her mid-candidature review panel, Professor Joseph Sirocci and Dr. Anne-Marie Gibson, who's a friend of IPPE's and led by Professor Herb Marsh. And I'd like to introduce the HDR panel of Holly's, which is Associate Professor Taryn Sanders as Principal Supervisor, Deputy Provost Professor Chris Lonsdale as Co-Supervisor, and we also welcome to IPPE North Sydney here, Dr. Justin Gugliano, hopefully pronounced your surname correctly, from Western Sydney University. Thank you. Sorry. And also, informally, also welcome back Professor Rich Ryan to our shores here. So without any further ado, I'll hand over to Holly to present. Thank you.
Thanks everyone for joining me for my mid-candidature review on the predictors and effects of long-term youth sport participation. Health is a state of complete physical, mental and social well-being and not merely the absence of disease or infirmity. Many determinants affect children's health, such as lifestyle factors, environmental, cultural influences and genetics. And good health is found in childhood and continues to influence outcomes in adulthood, including physical and mental health, socioeconomic status and other health risk behaviours. Youth sport is a contributor to children's health. We've defined it in my PhD as any formally arranged sport governed by rules and participated in by individuals under 18 years old outside of school and physical education time. In Australia, approximately 67% or 2 out of 3 of all children participate in organised sport at least once a fortnight. And children who participate in organised sport tend to accumulate more physical activity, are more likely to reach physical activity guidelines, have better mental health, social skills, and perform better academically than their non-sport participant counterparts. While sport is good to participate in at any time point in your life, continuous participation throughout childhood and adolescence contributes to lifelong health and well-being. It increases the likelihood of maintaining an active lifestyle through to adulthood, and continuity in sport can convert early gains into lifelong benefits across physical health, body composition, fitness, mental health, and well-being. Knowing the effects of long-term sport participation, for my PhD, I was interested in understanding what factors predict long-term sport participation, what outcomes are impacted by this, and then what the specific effect of long-term sport participation is on these outcomes. To do this, I've developed 3 studies. First, a systematic review and meta-analysis on the outcomes of longitudinal sport participation. Following this, I have a study on what is predicting long-term sport participation trajectories. And finally, a study on the cardiometabolic outcomes of youth participating in organised sport from childhood to early adolescence. I originally started in an MPhil with the final study as my MPhil study, but have since upgraded into PhD, adding on the first 2 studies. So today I'll be starting from the end with my study on cardiometabolic outcomes. But first, what is cardiometabolic health? So cardiometabolic health is made up by a combination of unique risk factors, including BMI, waist to height ratio, blood pressure, lipids, and glucose. Lifestyle factors such as physical activity, diet, and sleep quality impact cardiometabolic health. And having better cardiometabolic health decreases the risk of developing non-communicable diseases and conditions such as metabolic syndrome. Metabolic syndrome is a cluster of risk factors that increases the risk of heart disease and type 2 diabetes. And a recent systematic review found that it affects 3.3% of children, but up to 29.2% of obese children. Considering the increasing prevalence of obesity in children worldwide and the benefits of sport that we know, I was interested in knowing what the effect of youth sport is on cardiometabolic health. So my aim of my first study that I've completed is to analyse the effect of continued youth sport participation trends on cardiometabolic outcomes and the overall cardiometabolic risk of children. My questions included what organised sport trajectories exist from childhood to early adolescence for boys and girls, and how does cardiometabolic risk differ by these trajectories and sex. The strength of this study is that we used an Australian adolescent population, which hasn't really been used in the existing research on sport participation and cardiometabolic health. On top of this, we have a 5-year period of sport participation. We've adjusted for MBPA to specifically look at the effect of youth sport on cardiometabolic health, independent from the extra physical activity that kids tend to accumulate in sport. And we have objective measures of cardiometabolic health from blood tests. I included children from the birth cohort of the longitudinal study of Australian children from the ages of 6 to 7-ish to around 11 to 12, so over a 5-year period. First, I conducted a latent class analysis on longitudinal sport participation. A latent class analysis involves the clustering of multivariate discrete data to identify subgroups within a population based on shared characteristics. I chose to conduct this because it simplifies complex relationships to capture the underlying patterns, and the model fit statistics that we get can identify the most appropriate number of classes, so we know how many different trajectories of sport kids tend to participate in. After conducting the latent class analysis, I conducted regression analyses with these trajectories on a total cardiometabolic risk score, made up of some of the risk factors I presented earlier, including BMI and blood pressure, lipids, and glucose. And I conducted these analyses using our statistical software. We found 4 latent classes emerge from this analysis. These included children who started sport a bit later, children who've consistently participated across all time points, children who dropped out at around 10 to 11 years old, and then children who consistently did not participate. Our consistent participant class was took up the largest majority of our participants, and these classes are consistent across other research that we've seen with youth sport trajectories in Australia. When I regressed these trajectories with cardiometabolic risk score, the main finding that we found was that dropouts had a significantly worse cardiometabolic risk score, independent of whether or not we were adjusting for moderate to vigorous physical activity. We also found that consistent participants had marginally better cardiometabolic risk factor profiles, and late uptakes had marginally worse, though neither of these were significant. I then conducted a latent class analysis with team and individual sports separately, and we found 5 latent classes emerge from this data. First, we had non-participants who did neither team or individual sport at each time point. We had those who started in individual sport but transferred along to team sport, those that were consistent in both team and individual sport, and then those that either participated consistently in team or individual sport but not the other. And again, these classes are consistent with what we've seen in Australian populations so far. When I regressed these on cardiometabolic risk score, we found that children doing team sport in any capacity, whether just by itself or in conjunction with individual sport, had a more favourable cardiometabolic risk profile than non-participants. However, this was only the case when we weren't adjusting for moderate to vigorous physical activity, meaning that these results are most likely attributable to the extra physical activity that these children are doing. When we split this by sex, we only found this result was maintained for boys and not girls only. Overall, we found that dropping out of sport during adolescence is associated with a worse cardiometabolic risk profile, irrespective of moderate to vigorous physical activity levels. We found that consistent participation in team sports on its own or in combination of individual sports, particularly for boys, was associated with better cardiometabolic risk profiles, although this was attributed to MBPA. From this, I think that further research should aim to investigate whether long-term sport participation influences long-term cardiometabolic health, as a limitation of this study was that we only had cardiometabolic profiles at one time point. Additionally, research is needed to determine what the mechanisms are that are contributing to the poorer risk profile for the sport dropouts. And lastly, we need strategies to retain sport participants. Following on to this, I'll go back to my first study, which is on the outcomes of longitudinal youth sport participation, a systematic review and meta-analysis. The aim of this is to collate, synthesize and meta-analyze the effect of longitudinal sport participation on any outcomes measured in the literature. My questions include what outcomes have been measured in relation to longitudinal youth sport participation, how does long-term sport participation impact these outcomes, and what trajectories of youth sport participation exist in the literature. I included any children that were under the age of 18 at the first sport time point data collection. I included studies that compared at least 2 with in-person longitudinal sport participation groupings, with one at least being a consistent participant group and the other being either inconsistent or a non-participant group continuously. I included longitudinal studies or any cross-sectional studies that measured sport participation in youth retrospectively, and we included any outcome in this systematic review. But lastly, we did limit by English language, peer-reviewed journal articles, and those with full text available. From almost 15,000 search results across 4 databases, after removing duplicates, we had just under 10,000 results. We independently double screened these, leaving 283 full text articles to screen and ultimately including 89 studies in this review. We had 78 cohort studies and 11 cross-sectional studies. These were published from 2002 to 2025, with the majority published in the last 5 years. Most of them came from Australia, Brazil, America, and Canada, although we did have some studies published from Japan and a range of European countries. Across these studies, they had an average data collection of 6 time points across almost 7 years. Sport participation tended to be collected less frequently and over a shorter time frame at around 5 time points and just under 4.5 years in total. Studies grouped their participants into their sport participation classes differently. Almost 3/4 of them had some sort of manual grouping where they used some rules to group their participants, but we also had some using latent class methods, cumulative scoring, route-based trajectory modelling, and other clustering methods. Across the studies, we had 738 different outcomes reported. This is preliminary, but I've categorised and grouped them by study. And overall, we have studies reporting physical outcomes, behavioural health, well-being, cognitive health, and academic outcomes. The majority of these are across physical health, mostly in body composition, metabolic health, cardiovascular health, and skeletal health. But we also have a fair few outcomes related to physical activity, nutrition, and mental ill health. We conducted risk of bias using the JBI cohort and cross-sectional risk of bias tools. Across the studies, there was fairly low risk of bias among a few domains, including study recruitment and inclusion criteria, the identification and adjustment for confounders and covariates, the use of valid and reliable outcome measurements, and using appropriate statistic analyses. However, we also found some areas with high risk of bias. The biggest one we found was that most studies did not use a valid and reliable sport participation measure, which identifies a weakness across a lot of these cohort studies. We also found that most of them did not have complete follow-up, and if they didn't, a lot of them didn't explore the reasons for that, and many of them didn't use any strategies to address that incomplete follow-up. So far to date, I've completed my searches, all of the screening, and then double independent data extraction and risk of bias. At the moment, I've started to summarize the data using descriptive tables, and following that, I'll be doing meta-analyses on those categories identified and meta-regressions for any heterogeneous results based on different study characteristics. I'm hoping to finish that towards the end of the year so I can start my final study on the predictors of long-term youth sport participation trajectories. The aim for this is to determine the demographic, social, and ecological predictors of longitudinal youth sport participation trajectories. My research questions include what youth sport trajectories exist for Australian youth over an 8-year period, what demographic, social, and ecological factors predict membership for each class And then how do these differ by sex? Because we know that boys and girls participate in sport differently. Again, I'll be including children from the birth cohort of the longitudinal study of Australian children, though this time we'll be doing sport participation trajectories from 6 to 14 years old, so over an 8-year period. We'll be including predictors from demographic variables, from child-specific predictors such as injury and physical activity enjoyment, from family-level predictors like parental physical activity and the age of the youngest child in the home, and then environmental predictors like whether it's safe for children to play outside and whether they have access to parks and playgrounds. All analyses will be conducted using R again. First, I'll be conducting later class analyses to identify the trajectories. Following from that, I'll use multinomial regression to identify which predictors of organised sport are associated with each class. And I will be obtaining an ethics exemption from the university. I'm hoping to have my systematic review finalised by the end of the year so I can start my final study at the end of this year and towards the start of next year, hoping to have a manuscript ready for that towards mid next year so I can spend the rest of my time writing and finalising my thesis for submission in March in 2027. Thanks.
Holly, Herb?
Great presentation, great set of studies. What a joy it is to be on the panel when the material is so good. I also wanted to note that you must be a very special person because you got Ricky in here early to give you hand-baked cookies to celebrate your presentation. Really nice. I had a couple of methodological questions and really issues necessarily. Implicit in all of your research, I think, is the notion that sport has beneficial outcomes, metabolic in particular, but not necessarily limited to that. But I love to look at things from a reciprocal effects perspective. And it would be interesting to see to what extent there's a reciprocal effects that sport has and benefits on metabolic, but the metabolic also has a benefit on sport, and the two of them together complement each other in a way there's a positive spiral kind of thing. The other issue that go ahead and comment on that.
Well, first, I agree that not all outcomes might be beneficial. So for my review, I specifically included any outcomes that have been measured. And even in one of the included studies, we saw higher rates of binge drinking from boys who were team sport participants, which is not necessarily—
It wasn't necessarily the direction of the outcome, it was the direction of the causal ordering.
Yeah, sorry. Anyway, I'm sorry, I was getting to that next.
Okay.
But yeah, so with my cardiometabolic study, we couldn't look at that direction because we only have it from one time point, and it is a limitation of the study.
Yep.
But I'm hoping as well that through the predictors study, we'll get to look at what different variables are influencing the different trajectories that children are participating in sport. So there might be some that are a bit more negative, that are associated with children who are dropping out of sport potentially. So I think that might get to the other end there to see what is influencing sport participation and not just what is sport participation influencing. But yeah, that was a limitation of my cardiometabolic study that unfortunately we just didn't have access to any data for.
Or maybe fortunately, because it would have made the analysis a whole lot more complicated.
Maybe, yeah.
The other issue is, just tell me how you deal with a combination of cross-sectional longitudinal data in the same meta-analysis. I mean, it's clear that the things that you look at with typical cross-sectional data, which is the typical meta-analysis, you can look at that for the first wave or each wave, but there's unique information in the longitudinal studies that you can't necessarily get from the cross-sectional studies. I was just curious how you're going to take advantage of that.
So the longitudinal part of the systematic review is restricted only to the sport participation. So it had to have at least 2 time points, with the first being in childhood, so under the age of 18. And we've just taken outcomes from the final time point. There are some studies where they've reported a change in outcome, and then studies that have just reported the outcome at the final time point where sport participation was measured. And for those, we may not be able to combine them, so they may have to be done separately. But I'm hoping that some of the categories we've grouped things into mean that if that's the case, we can still do those analyses, but separate for where they don't kind of mesh well together.
So that would be a separate meta-analysis on the longitudinal studies.
Yeah, where we've got like a change from between time points.
Or a separate analysis. Yeah. Okay, good. Thank you.
Excellent.
Open it up to other
I'll
questions.
head over to the expert panel first. Anne-Marie and Joseph. Thanks, Anne-Marie.
Thanks, Holly, for a really great presentation and all your work so far. I guess my question is looking probably a little bit broader in terms of what the end goal of the research is in terms of impact, and where you think your research will have impact in terms of kind of youth sport and participation across Australian children and adolescents.
So I think each study kind of has a different potential impact. The review will be great to synthesize what our long-term effects of sport are, or the effects of long-term sport participation. So we know where there are benefits, but also potentially areas that need to be worked on. For example, if a specific risk behavior were to show a negative impact from sport, then that may be something that needs to be focused on in sporting organisations. For the predictors study, we might find that there are specific predictors that are associated with the less favourable sport trajectories. So if dropouts tended to have lower socioeconomic status, then maybe focusing on lower socioeconomic status areas to try to prevent some children from dropping out of sport. So yeah, I think there's a few different impacts. And then the cardiometabolic health, I think really what I've seen from that is just we first need to understand more about what the mechanism is for why dropouts are having that worse outcome, when it doesn't really, it's not associated with their physical activity levels. So first understanding that, so then we can target that to try to put things in place so that children dropping out of sport aren't ending up with those worse risk profiles.
Yeah, thanks, Holly. I think that, yeah, your second study, the predictors around kind of what is influencing these trajectories, will be the really important kind of applied research that we can use to really try and target some interventions. That's great. Second question is more just a reflective type question on your journey so far. What has been the most challenging aspect of kind of your HDR journey so far, and how did you kind of deal with this?
I think my most challenging aspect has been learning to use R. I had a bit of a data analysis background, but mostly using Excel. So while I understood a lot of the concepts behind it, moving it into code was a really big learning curve. Thankfully, Taryn has been a great help. He knows a thing or two about code apparently. And just learning as I go and having to utilize the skills that I've learned as I need them has just been the biggest thing, and asking for feedback when I think I need it.
Yeah, it sounds like you've got a very supportive supervisory panel, which is always helpful when you've got some statistical knowledge on your supervisory panel. They're all my questions. Thanks, Holly.
Thank you.
Thank you, Anne-Marie. Joseph?
Yes, Holly, great presentation. I just have a couple of quick questions for you. The numbers in your sample of non-participation and dropout, I thought it was much worse than that. It's 9% non-participation, 8% dropout, which suggests 17% of kids are just not doing sport probably as they get older. Is this something about the sample, or is that true for Australia?
It could be to do with the sample, with just who's participating in this cohort study year after year, if that happens to be kids who are more active. But again, we know that 2/3 of children tend to participate in sport. So while the numbers are different, we do have a large majority of our Australian population of children participating. So I wasn't surprised to see such a high number in the consistent participation group.
Okay, I was surprised because it becomes more in Australia. By the time you hit 15, all of it's rep and it becomes more selective and competitive. And I see, at least anecdotally, it seems like a lot of people drop out, but maybe they get pushed to more community-based sport. Yeah, that I guess that's good news. So the other thing I think is probably the most interesting finding you have so far is that dropouts do worse than non-participation, which is kind of scary because it's like if you're going to get your kid involved, you better keep them there, or there could be problems. So I'm just wondering, or just don't make it participate. But I work in the rep area in basketball, and I see like a lot of it has to do with I would guess, with context, with the social support. Is the kid's parents going through divorce, that kind of thing? So there could be these kind of confounding factors. You mentioned some potential physical factors of detraining, some effects of being a kind of intense athlete and then stopping. And then there could be psychological factors, losing your group, losing your friendship group. I'm just wondering if you could, I think your works are really complete, and now it sounds like you're moving into this direction. If you could talk about how you would test whether the explanation for dropouts being worse than non-participants is physical, psychological, or social. Like how are you going to go about that? What would you speculate is going on?
I haven't really planned that far ahead because it's not within the scope of that first study. But I think it would be really interesting at some point to have cardiometabolic health data at 2 time points. First of all, to track whether those children had the worst risk scores to start with, because then it may not be that it's an effect of them dropping out. It may just be that children who drop out of sport already had a worse risk profile to start with.
Oh yeah.
But yeah, so I along with the detraining hypothesis, and the idea that kids who participate in sport tend to have some better health behaviors to start with. It could be a range of things, and I think it would be interesting to look at that in a separate study. It just wasn't in the scope of my original one.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you.
Joseph. Open to the floor. Any other questions here or online?
Sorry, you go. Quick question. How do you handle the pre-existing difference problem? So I'll go into elementary school classroom, and the kids are different on physical ability, metabolic stuff as well. How do you handle that throughout your study?
Well, in my cardiometabolic study, we adjust for socioeconomic position, which was made up of parent education level and income. We also adjust for physical activity status, and we adjust for sexual maturity status.
What's physical activity status?
Sorry, not physical activity status. We adjusted for minutes of MCR, which were calculated across a week. So we do adjust for some of those baseline differences, mostly demographically. But we didn't really do anything past that. And considering we only had the cardiometabolic data at the final time point, we can't tell whether there was a change, there was a difference to start with.
Yeah, thanks.
Emma?
I don't have a super big question, Holly. I just wanted to say congratulations.
Thank you.
I think that it's so good that you upgraded from an MPhil to a PhD, because you and this are like a vision of what a good quality and on track PhD should look like. So congratulations.
Thank you.
I am interested though, it looks like from study 2, about which you obviously know the most, that sport participation accounts for like relatively little of these beneficial outcomes when you control for MVPA. But you still sound like you're really behind sport participation. Is that something personal for you? Like you love sport, team sport, individual sport? Like you seem like, do you think it's a really important thing? I'm curious about that.
Yeah, I grew up probably trying most sports out there. My mum always had us in a sport, and that was just, we were just always doing a sport. So I think sport is important because it's been a really important part of my life. But I think regardless of any of these results and any of the outcomes, there's always some that are beneficial. So it may not be beneficial specifically for cardiometabolic health in every aspect, but there's still some benefits you get. And just because you don't get one of them I don't think it's enough of a reason to say that no one should do sport, because it then negates every other benefit you could be getting.
Sure. I was also curious about just the link between MBPA and time doing team sport in the LSAC data. Are they, do you know if they're related or what?
Yeah, so the team sport participants had the highest levels of MBPA.
Okay, yeah. So
Yeah.
there's 40 people.
Yeah,
The message is like kids sporty.
yeah.
Yeah.
Just following up on that, keep kids sporty, there's a motivation literature out there about why people drop out of sports and what kind of, do you have any variables that have to do with the social context, the coaching or the peer context that might be a predictor of dropping out of sport?
We do have one in the LSAC data about enjoyment of physical activity. So I think that will be interesting to see. It's not directly motivation, but I would think that children who are not enjoying sport are much more likely to drop out. We'll see what happens when I run the analysis, obviously. But we do have a few things, not motivation specifically, but I think will be quite closely linked.
There's also, I think, parental warmth and hostility in that data as well, which is obviously would potentially, most likely, parents are playing a role in they're getting kids into sport parts, so if they're really controlling, maybe they're less likely to stay stuck with it.
Yeah, we have the parenting styles. We also have like parental physical activity. So whether some of that motivation comes from their role models. So yeah, I think that'll be interesting to see, but I just haven't had the time to start that one yet.
This is an aside, but I was telling Herb this morning that in the same data set, so they have enjoyment of physical activity, but they also have, given the choice, would your child choose to be active, inactive or active, doesn't matter, or inactive, or they choose to pass home, which sends a lot of fake SDT. And for an MPhil MCyber project, we looked at whether or not the relationship between sports participation and psychological outcomes was moderated by children's choice to participate in sport. And we find that the kids who participate in sport but don't want to get none of the psychological benefits. Yeah. It's almost like some whereas even though there's this big gap in general, so part of what's being fit in there is actually the children's choice to participate. And they probably participate that way.
Thank you, Tarek.
But what I found quite interesting about that was that they had all the metabolic benefits. So that even though they didn't want, that they weren't interested in it, they still got all the those benefits, but it was the psychological
Right.
that it was in. So the distinction between those two of my thought was quite amazing.
Yeah,
quite
that's
interesting.
true.
I think that especially from the SCT perspective, yeah.
All right, Anne-Marie?
Yeah, so quick question. Sorry, Holly, I've just remembered. For study 2, are you planning to look at gender differences in terms of predictors of the trajectories?
Yeah, so I think I'll do that similar to my first study. So also compare the trajectories, which in the cardiometabolic study, I think for the most part they were the same. So I'm expecting to see that again. But I will check that just to see whether those trajectories do differ. Specifically because we'll be going from a 5-year time frame of sport participation to an 8-year one, and those older ages is where we might see a difference in those trajectories. And then we'll also have a look at the predicted differences by sex.
Yeah, because you're looking now at that transition from primary to secondary in your second, the 14 to 16. So I think there may be some gender differences there, which obviously has applied implications around kind of what to target for girls versus boys, etc.
Yeah.
Great, thank you.
Thank you, Anne-Marie. And thank you for the comments here in the chat. So I've just shown those to Holly as well. So there you go. All right, any other questions here from the audience? Going once?
I got one more. Why the profile analysis?
Well, in discussions with my supervisors, we chose to do that because it just has a bit more of a statistical underpinning than just manually picking like, okay, well, you did sport 4 times. So Eurosport at all of the time points. And an issue with that is that if we have, say, 4 different time points, we might have someone who's participating and then not, and then participating and then not. And we end up with all these different groupings, and the latent profile, the latent class analysis just kind of, it ties them together a little nicer to give us these underlying patterns that tend to occur a lot more.
That's it. Final call. All right. So that ends it very much. Thank you. Can you please give another round of applause for Holly? So what I'd like to do is, can I ask Anne-Marie and Joseph to stay on the line there, and we'll get you to do your deliberations shortly. Thank you very much.